Let me tell you something that happened this morning. Something most people are going to completely misread, and I'm going to be direct with you from the beginning. This is not a complicated story. It's actually very simple. But simple stories are often the ones that quietly reshape everything in ways people only understand later. Yesterday, Iran announced that the Strait of Hormuz was fully open. Donald Trump responded with a loud "thank you." Markets surged almost instantly. Oil prices dropped. Analysts rushed onto television declaring de-escalation. And across global media, the same narrative repeated itself. Deal close, tensions easing, war possibly ending, Hormuz open, creating the impression that America had just secured a strategic win, a moment of restored control, a signal that sustained pressure had finally worked and forced movement. But then, this morning, Iran reversed that signal and closed it again. The IRGC declaring that control had returned to strict military management, armed forces back in position, ships turning around in the Persian Gulf, tankers going dark with multiple vessels, Greek and Indian, approaching and then abruptly U-turning, while at least one tanker stopped transmitting its location entirely. And more importantly, Iran didn't frame this as economic pressure or even military confrontation. It used a very deliberate word: piracy, maritime robbery, which is not just rhetorical escalation, but a legal and strategic framing designed to reshape how neutral countries interpret legitimacy in these waters and who they believe is acting outside accepted norms. And here's the key point. This was not unpredictable. This did not emerge out of chaos or sudden emotion. This follows a pattern that could be seen long before the first strike was launched. Because when you step back and apply a structural lens, especially through game theory and long-cycle strategic analysis, the outcome becomes almost inevitable. The core question is always the same. What does each side actually want? Not what they say publicly for diplomacy or messaging, but what they need structurally to maintain power and relevance over time. America says it wants stability, open shipping lanes, a deal, de-escalation. But what it actually needs is to demonstrate that it still controls the world's most critical energy choke point and can enforce that control through pressure, not just for Iran, but as a signal to China, Russia, and every state quietly evaluating whether American power still functions the way it did in previous decades. While Iran, on the surface, talks about sanctions, relief, sovereignty, and access to frozen assets, but at a deeper level, what it needs is to transform its position from an isolated and sanctioned actor into an unavoidable strategic player by embedding itself into the functioning of Hormuz, so that every country moving energy through that corridor must implicitly accept Iranian authority as part of the system. Because once that reality exists in practice, once ships coordinate, once routes are shaped, once behavior adjusts, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse regardless of military force or diplomatic pressure. And these two objectives fundamentally clash at their core. America cannot prove dominance if Iran is exercising control in real time, and Iran cannot establish lasting relevance if it submits to that dominance, meaning there is no clean compromise, no stable middle ground, only shifting forms of the same struggle playing out over time under different labels. Which is why the expectation that pressure alone would force Iran to fold was always flawed, not because Iran is immune to pressure, but because pressure and collapse are not the same thing. Iran is clearly under economic and military strain, its currency under pressure, its infrastructure damaged, its economy stressed, its internal system stretched, but it has not crossed into systemic collapse. And that gap between suffering and breaking is where the real story exists, and where most analysis fails. Because over the last decade, a parallel structure was quietly built that allows Iran to absorb pressure without losing agency, and that structure is deeply tied to China, not in a simplistic alliance sense or ideological partnership, but as an economic and logistical architecture designed deliberately to function outside traditional Western leverage points, including alternative payment systems that bypass dollar-based networks and reduce exposure to sanctions, a shadow maritime network capable of moving oil under layers of obfuscation and deniability through transponder manipulation, flag switching, and offshore transfers, long-term energy reserves that cushion shocks and stabilize supply chains during disruption, and intelligence or surveillance cooperation that alters how battlefield awareness and targeting operate in practice. All of which combine to create a situation where Iran continues to operate, continues to generate revenue even if reduced, and most importantly, continues to choose rather than being forced into a decision under pressure. And that is why what happened this morning matters. It signals that Iran still retains strategic flexibility despite sustained pressure, that it can open and close Hormuz, not as a reaction to events, but as a calculated move, a lever it can pull to send signals, shape negotiations, and test responses. So when you step back and connect all of this, the conclusion becomes clear. This was never about a single announcement or a single day. It is the result of long-term positioning and layered preparation. Iran's actions are not random defiance or emotional reactions. but calculated moves within a system that allows it to resist without collapsing. And the bigger question now is not what Iran will do next in the immediate sense, but whether other powers fully recognize that this is no longer a simple two-player dynamic, but a layered, strategic environment where unseen structures matter as much as visible actions. Because once a third structural force is embedded into the system, ignoring it does not remove it. It just means you are reacting to outcomes instead of shaping them. And if a decade of quiet preparation produced this moment, then whatever is being built quietly right now will shape the next one in ways that, once again, most people will only understand after it has already happened. Because in geopolitics, the most decisive moves are rarely the loudest ones or the ones that dominate headlines. They are the ones that sit in the background, unnoticed and unchallenged, accumulating strength until suddenly they define the entire game and leave everyone else trying to catch up to a reality that has already been constructed.